I never thought my life would end the day my wife looked
Take
me in
him.
the eyes
He's
and
yours.
said, "Take him. He's yours." I was handed over to a stranger like I meant nothing. But the real shock came later, when I discovered I wasn't kidnapped for ransom. I was sold. And the man who took me wasn't my enemy at all. He might have been the only reason I was still alive.
Everything you knew is gone.
But when I finally learned the truth behind my wife's betrayal, everything changed, including me. I never thought my life would end like this. I came home that night thinking everything was normal. My wife said, "You are late again," but her voice felt cold. I smiled and said, "I had work, nothing else." She didn't reply, just stared at me like I was a stranger. Then the door opened and everything changed. A man stood inside the room, tall and silent. My wife looked at him and said, "We are ready." I frowned and asked, "Ready for what?" The man finally spoke, "For him." I felt my heart beat faster. "What is this?" I asked my wife. She avoided my eyes and said, "You will understand soon." The man stepped closer and said, "You need to come with me." I stepped back and shouted, "I am not going anywhere." My wife finally looked at me and said, "You already belong to him now." I froze, unable to understand her words. The man grabbed my arm suddenly. I struggled and shouted, "Let me go." My wife turned away as if I didn't exist. I yelled, "Rena, why are you doing this to me?" She finally said the words that destroyed me, "Take him. He's yours." My world shattered in that moment. The man pulled me toward the door. I screamed, "You can't do this." She didn't even look back. The hallway felt endless as I was dragged away. I kept shouting her name but she never responded. The man beside me said nothing. I whispered, "Why is this happening to me?" The cold night air hit my face when we stepped outside. I looked at the man and said, "Where are you taking me?" He replied, "Somewhere you will understand the truth." I laughed painfully. "Truth? My wife just sold me." He didn't answer. I felt my life break into pieces. We reached a black car waiting in silence. He pushed me inside without a word. I banged the window and shouted, "Let me out." The car started moving into the dark road. I looked back one last time hoping she would stop this. But she stood still at the doorway. I shouted again, "Rena?" No response came. The man finally said, "This is your new reality now." I leaned back and felt my chest tighten. I whispered, "I don't understand any of this." The silence in the car made everything worse. I closed my eyes but tears still came. I kept thinking my wife really did this to me. Everything I believed about my life felt like a lie. I turned to the man and asked, "Why me?" He said, "Because she chose you." I shook my head, "That makes no sense." The car continued into the darkness without stopping. I whispered to myself, "My life ended tonight." The man beside me finally spoke again. He said, "And a new one begins now." I stared into the dark road ahead. I woke up on a cold bed inside a large room I didn't recognize. My head was heavy and I tried to sit up but my hands felt restricted. The door opened and a man walked in silently. He said, "You're finally awake." I said, "Where am I? What is this place?" The man behind him stood still watching me closely. A calm voice came from the corner of the room. "You are not a prisoner by accident," he said. I forced myself up and shouted, "What did you do to me?" He stepped forward slowly, his expression completely unreadable. "You were never taken by mistake," he said. My chest tightened as I looked around the room again. I said, "My wife will come for me." He replied, "Your wife already decided your fate." I felt anger rising and shouted, "That's a lie." The guard, Lucas, finally moved but only slightly. He said nothing and kept staring at me. Adrian turned away as if my anger meant nothing. "You will stay here until I decide otherwise," he said. I laughed bitterly, "You can't keep me here forever." He looked at me finally, eyes cold and controlled. "This is not prison. This is protection," he said. I whispered, "Protection from what?" He didn't answer, only turned and left the room. Lucas followed silently behind him. I stood there shaking, trying to understand everything. I said softly, "What did my wife do?" The room felt heavier than before. A faint voice echoed, "This is only the beginning." I walked to the window and saw guards outside the gates. Freedom felt close but completely impossible. I said, "Why am I here if this is protection?" Lucas finally spoke, "You asked too many questions." I turned sharply, "Then give me answers." Adrian's voice came from the hallway, calm and distant. "You will learn everything in time," he said. I shouted, "I don't have time." Adrian appeared at the doorway, watching me carefully. You are important to this story, he said. I frowned. What story are you talking about? He didn't answer again, just studied my face. For the first time, I felt fear mixing with confusion. I whispered, what did my wife really do to me? Silence answered me more than words ever could. I realized I was not just taken. I was placed into something bigger. I leaned against the wall trying to steady my breath. I said, Adrian, tell me the truth. All of it. He stepped closer, voice low and controlled. You will understand soon enough, he said again. I shook my head, feeling trapped in silence. I said, I hate this place. Lucas watched me without emotion. The mansion felt like a cage built from silence. Adrian said, cages can protect or destroy. I laughed softly, unable to decide if he was lying. I said, then I choose neither cage. Adrian finally turned away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. He said, you will choose soon enough. I stared at the locked door, feeling my life change forever. I whispered, I will find the truth. Outside, the night felt endless and silent. Lucas said, you already are inside it. I closed my eyes, knowing nothing would ever be the same again. I was no longer a free man anymore now. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at Adrian. I said, tell me everything. No more games. Adrian watched me quietly before replying, you are finally ready to hear it. I frowned and said, ready? My life is destroyed. He stepped closer and said, your life was used. I shook my head, used by who? He replied, by your wife. My chest tightened. I said, that's impossible. Adrian looked at Lucas and then back at me. She was involved in illegal financial deals. I said, you're lying. He said, Victor handled most of it. Your wife signed everything. I felt anger rising. Victor? Who is he to me? Adrian replied, her partner. And your downfall. I whispered, no, she wouldn't do that. Adrian said, she already did. I closed my eyes. All my memories are fake then? He said, not fake. Just used. I shouted, then why am I here? Adrian said, because she needed a scapegoat. I stepped back shaking. She sold me? He said, yes. Silence filled the room. Then I said, you kidnapped me for money too? Adrian shook his head. No. I frowned, then why? He said, to keep you alive. I froze. Alive. He said, people want you dead. Victor's partners. I whispered, Detective Miller is looking for me. Adrian said, he is not your enemy. But he is late. I said, so you are my savior now? He replied, no. I am still the one who took you. I laughed bitterly, so what are you? He said, someone who stopped you from dying. I sat down slowly, my mind breaking. I said, I don't trust you. Adrian nodded, good. You shouldn't. I whispered, then what do I do now? He said, learn the truth fully. I looked at him and said, and my wife? He replied, she will come for you again. I clenched my fists, then I will face her. Adrian said, not yet. I asked, why are you telling me this now? He said, because you needed to stop being blind. I closed my eyes, feeling everything collapse inside me. I whispered, my life was never mine. Adrian said softly, now it is starting to be. I looked at Adrian and said, if what you say is true, then my entire life was a lie. He replied, not a lie. A setup. I asked, and Detective Miller? Will he find me? Adrian said, if he finds you now, you die. I swallowed hard and said, so I am trapped either way. He answered, for now. I whispered, I don't even know who to hate anymore. Adrian said, start with the truth, not emotion. I said, and Victor? He replied, he will come for you when he learns you are alive. I clenched my fists and said, then I will be ready this time. Adrian looked at me and said, that is the first right thing you have said. I nodded slowly, still trying to breathe through the shock now. I stayed inside the mansion for days, feeling trapped but strangely alive. Adrian never treated me like a prisoner anymore. He said, you can move inside the house but not outside. I asked him, why are you doing this to me? He replied, because you are still alive for a reason. I laughed and said, I do not even know what that reason is. He looked at me and said, you will. Lucas watched me every time I walked through the hall. He never spoke much but his eyes followed me. I met Elena in the kitchen one morning. She whispered, you should not trust everyone here. I asked, even Adrian? She paused and said, especially him. Security Chief Ray did not like me. He said to Adrian, "Why is he walking freely?" Adrian said, "Because I allowed it." Ray said, "He is a risk." I said, "I am right here, you know." Ray ignored me. One night everything changed. I heard footsteps outside my room. I whispered, "Who is there?" No answer. I opened the door slowly. Someone lunged at me. I shouted, "Stop." A gun clicked. Adrian appeared instantly and grabbed the attacker. He said, "Too slow." I stood frozen. I said, "You saved me." He replied, "I told you you are not allowed to die yet." After that I could not sleep. I asked him, "Why would someone try to kill me?" He said, "Victor's people found a trace." I said, "So I am being hunted?" He said, "Yes." I said, "And my wife?" He said, "She is already moving on publicly." That hit me harder than anything. I said, "She is acting like I never existed." He said, "That is how she survives." I felt something break inside me. I said, "I hate her." Adrian said, "Good hate keeps you alive." Elena later told me, "Be careful around Ray." I asked, "Why?" She said, "He wants control over you." I said, "I am not a thing to control." Ray confronted me in the hallway. He said, "You do not belong here." I said, "Neither does anyone in chains." He stepped closer but Adrian stopped him. Adrian said, "Enough both of you." Ray backed off but stared at me. I realized something that night. I said to myself, I am not just a prisoner anymore. I am part of their war now. The mansion felt quieter after that night. I walked alone thinking everything had changed. Adrian watched me from a distance but said nothing. Elena gave me water and said, "Stay strong." I nodded without speaking. Lucas stood at the door still silent. I finally understood nothing here was simple anymore. Every step I took mattered. I whispered, "I will survive this no matter what." Adrian heard me and said, "Good, because this is only the beginning." I asked Adrian, "What happens next?" He said, "You will see soon enough." I said, "I am tired of waiting." He replied, "Patience is survival." I looked at him and said, "I do not want to be part of any war." He said, "You already are." I clenched my fists and said, "Then I will choose my side carefully." Adrian nodded slowly and said, "That is the first real choice you have made." I stared into the dark, realizing everything had already begun shaping my new life inside this house. I sat across from Adrian and said, "You are trusting me too much now." He replied, "No. I am trusting you just enough." I frowned and said, "That is not reassuring." He looked at me and said, "You are no longer useless in this situation." I asked, "So what am I now?" He answered, "Useful." I didn't like that word, but I didn't argue. Lucas stood near the door as always, silent, watching. Adrian said, "You need to understand your wife's structure fully." I said, "I already understand she betrayed me." He replied, "That is emotional understanding, not strategic." I said, "Then teach me." He placed a file in front of me. "Victor controls half her illegal network." I said, "And my wife?" He said, "She is the face, not the brain." I felt anger rise again. "She used me." He nodded, "Yes. And now she is losing everything." I asked, "How?" He said, "Investors are pulling out. Harris is questioning her accounts." I said, "Her lawyer?" He replied, "Even he is starting to doubt her." I leaned back and said, "Good." Adrian looked at me and said, "You are changing." I said, "I have to." He said, "Sophia is helping us from inside." I asked, "Who is Sophia?" He said, "An investigator who wants Victor gone." I said, "So everyone is playing a game?" He replied, "You are finally inside it." Days later I saw reports. My wife Rena was losing control publicly. Headlines called her unstable. Investors were leaving fast. I read it and felt nothing warm inside me. Only silence. I said, "She is falling." Adrian said, "She is collapsing." I asked, "And Victor?" He said, "He betrayed her first." That surprised me. I said, "So they are destroying each other?" He nodded, "And you are the reason the balance broke." I said, "I didn't do anything." He replied, "Existing is enough in this war." I walked away and whispered, "I used to be afraid of her." Elena came beside me and said, "Do you still feel that fear?" I said, "No. I feel empty." She said, "Empty is dangerous." Ray watched me from a distance and said, "You are getting too comfortable." I said, Comfortable? I am still trapped here. He replied, but now you think like them. I said, maybe that is survival. Later I overheard Harris on a call. He said, she is hiding something. The numbers don't match. I whispered, even her lawyer is turning. Sophia appeared one night and said, Victor will strike soon. I asked, against who? She said, everyone. I nodded slowly and said, then let him. Adrian heard me and said, that is the first time you sounded ready. I looked at him and said, I am not afraid of losing any more. He replied, that is where power begins. For the first time I believed him a little. I was sitting in the room when Adrian said, she knows you are alive now. I looked up and said, Rena? He nodded. Yes. And she knows where you are. I felt my stomach tighten. I said, how did she find out? Adrian replied, Victor leaked it. Or someone inside her circle did. I stood up fast. So she is coming for me? He said, not just you. Me too. I laughed once and said, good. Let her come. Lucas stepped forward and said, you are not ready for that. I turned to him and said, when will I ever be ready? Adrian raised his hand and said, stop. Both of you. Then my phone rang. I looked at it and froze. It was an unknown number. I said, should I answer? Adrian said, no. But I answered anyway. Her voice came through immediately. You are alive. I went silent. She said, you are really alive, and with him. I said, why are you calling me? She said, come back. We can fix everything. I laughed and said, fix what? You sold me. She paused. Then said, you don't understand what I was protecting. I said, don't lie to me anymore. Her voice softened. I still love you. I felt anger rise. Love doesn't sell people. She said, you were never meant to be part of this. I said, but I am. Adrian signaled me to hang up. I said into the phone, I am not coming back. Her voice changed instantly. You think he will protect you forever? I said, better than you ever did. Silence. Then she said, if you don't come back, I will take everything from you. I replied, you already did. I ended the call. My hands were shaking. Adrian said, now it starts. I said, she sounded desperate. He replied, no. She sounded dangerous. Later I got messages, money offers, threats, old photos, memories. Rena texted, you belong with me. I deleted it. Elena saw my face and said, she reached you. I said, she tried. Ray stood nearby and said, she will not stop. I said, neither will I. Adrian said quietly, good? Because this is no longer personal for her. It is survival. I asked, and for me? He looked at me and said, for you it is rebirth. That word stayed in my mind longer than I expected. I finally said, I will not go back to her. Adrian nodded once. Then you are free from her chain. For the first time, I believed I had truly stepped out of my old life. I was standing in the hall when the doors suddenly burst open. Rena walked in with two men behind her. She said, I am taking him back. I looked at her and said, you don't get to decide that anymore. Her eyes widened. What did you just say? Adrian stepped forward and said, he is not yours. Rena shouted, he is my husband. I shook my head and said, I was. Silence hit the room. She laughed nervously and said, they changed you. I replied, no. You did. Her face tightened. I did what I had to do. I said, you sold me. She shouted, I saved you from dying. Adrian stepped between us. Enough. Rena pointed at him and said, this is all because of you. Adrian said, no. This is because of your choices. I looked at her and said, I am done being part of your choices. She froze. What are you saying? I said, I am not going back with you. Her voice cracked. You don't mean that. I said, I do. Rena's eyes filled with tears. After everything, I loved you. I felt nothing now. I said, love doesn't destroy people. She stepped closer. I can fix this. I stepped back and said, there is nothing left to fix. Her men moved forward, but Adrian raised his gun. He said, one step and this ends badly. Everything stopped. Rena looked around and whispered, this isn't me. I said, it became you. She dropped to her knees. I lost everything. I said quietly, no. You threw it away. Sirens sounded outside. Victor's network was collapsing. Adrian grabbed his side, injured but still standing. I rushed to him and said, "Are you okay?" He said, "I've had worse." Rena was taken away screaming my name, but I didn't move. I just watched. One of the guards said, "It's over." I said, "No, it's beginning." Later the house was quiet. I stood with Adrian and said, "What happens now?" He replied, "Now you choose who you are." I looked at the broken world around me and said, "I am not her husband anymore." He nodded. I said, "Not a prisoner either." He asked, "Then what are you?" I looked at him and said, "Someone who survived." He said, "That is enough." I finally felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. I whispered, "I am free." And for the first time, I believed it.